Viewer discretion is advised.
Brad Keith Sigmon was an American convicted murderer who was imprisoned for the 2001 double murder of his ex-girlfriend's parents in South Carolina. Sigmon was convicted of battering David and Gladys Larke, aged 62 and 59 respectively, to death with a baseball bat on April 27, 2001, a week after he and his former girlfriend had broken up. Subsequently, Sigmon was found guilty and given 2 death sentences for the double murder. He was also given a 30-year jail term for first-degree burglary for stealing from the Larkes on the day of the murders. Sigmon was executed by firing squad on March 7, 2025, becoming the first person in almost 15 years to be executed by this method after Ronnie Lee Gardner, as well as the oldest person executed in the state. Brad Sigmon, the eldest of 5 children, was born on November 12, 1957, in the U.S. state of South Carolina and raised in various towns across the state. Sigmon was first raised in both Taylors and Greer, South Carolina. Sigmon's mother was only 17 years old when she gave birth to him and bore her 4 younger children within 1 year apart from each other. Sigmon's father was part of the U.S. military. Due to his line of work, the family frequently needed to move, including to the Philippines shortly after the birth of Sigmon's 5th and youngest sibling. Sigmon's parents eventually divorced when he was still young, as Sigmon's father, Ronnie Sigmon, was an alcoholic who often abused his wife. This, along with the other challenges of being a young mother and adapting to military life, proved difficult for Sigmon's mother, Virginia Wooten. Although Ronnie allegedly never laid a hand on his 4 younger children, he did physically abuse Sigmon because Sigmon, as the eldest child, would often try to protect his mother from being beaten by his father. Sigmon's parents eventually remarried, and Sigmon often moved back and forth between the homes of his parents and step-parents. Despite these events, Sigmon overall had a normal childhood. Sigmon began to work at age 16 while still in high school in Simpsonville so as to help alleviate his family's financial burden. After his parents' divorce, he took on the responsibility of taking care of his younger siblings. At the age of 18, Sigmon's string of criminal activity began in Greer with an armed robbery charge on May 29, 1976. The following year, Sigmon dropped out of high school, merely 9 weeks before he was scheduled to graduate, in order to get married in 1977. They moved out of the upstate to settle in Manning, South Carolina shortly before their marriage, and would later have 1 son. According to Sigmon's son, parents, siblings, stepfather, Virginia's second husband, and aunt, Sigmon was a loving son, father, and brother who deeply cared about his family. Court sources revealed that Sigmon struggled with both drug use problems and mental health issues during his adulthood. Sigmon returned back to Greenville County in the 1990s when he last resided in the city of Greenville. On April 27, 2001, 43-year-old Brad Sigmon committed the double murder of his ex-girlfriend's parents, William David Larke, better known as David Larke and Gladys Gwendolyn Larke, in Taylors, South Carolina. Prior to the double murder, Sigmon and a woman named Rebecca Barbare had been in a romantic relationship for about 3 years and lived together in a trailer close to Barbare's parents' home. However, earlier that year, after Barbare ended their relationship and moved in with her parents, Sigmon became progressively more obsessed with her, even going as far as to stalk her in an attempt to check if she had another man, in addition to his requests to rekindle their relationship. On the eve of the murder, April 26, 2001, Sigmon and his friend, Eugene Struve, spent the night drinking alcohol and consuming cocaine. The following morning, Sigmon informed Struve that when Barbare left to take her children to school, he planned to go to the Larkes' house, tie her parents up, and get a hold of Barbare. Struve was initially supposed to follow along with Sigmon's plan, but he later backed out. Sigmon entered the home of the Larkes alone, located at 948 East Darby Road in Taylors, where he found 62-year-old David Larke in the kitchen and 59-year-old Gladys Larke in the living room. Armed with a baseball bat, Sigmon attacked the couple, beating them one after another with the bat, going back and forth between the 2 rooms. Sigmon stopped the assault after the couple died. Each of the Larkes sustained 9 blows to their heads, which crushed their skulls. After murdering the Larkes, Sigmon stole David's gun and waited for Barbare to return home. When Barberry arrived back home, Sigmon forced her into a 2001 Honda Passport at gunpoint. Sigmon's plan was to pick up his own car and drive to North Carolina with Barberry. However, Barberry managed to jump out of the car and run away. Sigmon shot at her while giving chase, but Barberry managed to escape. Sigmon then gave up and fled the scene. Barberry subsequently underwent treatment in the Greenville Memorial Hospital. After the murders became known, the police conducted a nationwide manhunt for Sigmon. A charge sheet was issued for Sigmon on charges of murder, pertaining to the Larkes, and kidnapping and assault with intent to kill, pertaining to Barberry's abduction. Sigmon was eventually captured in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, after he went on the run for 11 days. Then, he was extradited back to South Carolina. The state authorities also planned to seek the death penalty for Sigmon with respect to the double murder charges. After his arrest, Brad Sigmon was indicted by a South Carolina grand jury for 2 counts of murder, first-degree burglary, and other offenses, including kidnapping. Sigmon eventually stood trial in July 2002 for both counts of murder and a single count of first-degree burglary, and he reportedly admitted his guilt to the jury. The jury subsequently found him guilty of all charges, and they would decide on his sentence. The prosecution sought the death penalty for Sigmon, stating that both Gladys and David Larke lived through the most horrific death, and based on the aggravating factors of the case, Sigmon should be sentenced to death, so as to show him the same mercy he demonstrated to his victims. The defense, in response, urged the jury to consider that Sigmon acted out due to his relationship issues. Seeking life imprisonment for Sigmon, the defense cited the mitigating factors of Sigmon's case, including his good behavior in jail and adulthood drug problems. Eventually, the jury unanimously agreed to sentence Sigmon to death for both counts of murder on July 20, 2002. Apart from the 2 death sentences, Sigmon was also sentenced to 30 years in prison for the burglary charge. On December 19, 2005, the South Carolina Supreme Court turned down Brad Sigmon's direct appeal against his 2 death sentences and double murder conviction. On May 8, 2013, Sigmon's second appeal to the South Carolina Supreme Court was also rejected. On September 30, 2018, the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina dismissed Sigmon's first federal appeal. On April 14, 2020, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected Sigmon's appeal. On January 11, 2021, Sigmon's final appeal was dismissed by the U.S. Supreme Court. After exhausting all his avenues of appeal, Brad Sigmon was originally scheduled to be executed on February 12, 2021. However, on February 5, 2021, 1 week before his execution date, Sigmon was issued an indefinite stay of execution by the South Carolina Supreme Court. The court found that the state did not have the drugs necessary to facilitate the execution of Sigmon by lethal injection, which was the state's sole legal method of execution. At that time, South Carolina had effectively imposed an unofficial moratorium on executions following the state's last execution in 2011. This was due to a shortage of lethal injection drugs caused by the expiration of existing supplies and the refusal of many pharmaceutical companies to sell drugs for executions. In response to the state's inability to carry out lethal injections, lawmakers in South Carolina passed new legislation to reintroduce and legalize the electric chair and firing squad as alternative methods for future executions when lethal injection was not an option. The absence of lethal injection drugs in the state would eventually be resolved in September 2023, after the state authorities had successfully acquired new drugs, allowing it to resume lethal injection executions. After the new laws were passed, Sigmon and another death row inmate, Freddie Eugene Owens, had new execution dates set. Sigmon was rescheduled to be executed by the electric chair on June 18, 2021, while Owens's date was set exactly 1 week later, June 25, 2021. However, Sigmon's second death warrant was suspended, and in turn Owens's, after the South Carolina Supreme Court ruled that the executions of Sigmon and Owens should be postponed until they were given the choice of death by electrocution or firing squad, especially because the legalization of latter option was yet to be finalized, and the former option was the sole available execution method at this point in time. Another reason the court stayed their executions was that both Owens and Sigmon had filed a lawsuit against the state's revival of the electric chair. A year later, Sigmon's third death warrant was issued, rescheduling his execution date to May 13, 2022. However, in light of a lawsuit filed by the condemned against the electric chair and firing squad execution methods, Sigmon received another stay of execution until the full resolution of the lawsuit. In 2023, Brad Sigmon was among several death row prisoners who filed a lawsuit against South Carolina over the state's decision to introduce the firing squad and electric chair as alternative execution methods. The inmates argued that these methods were unconstitutional because they could inflict unnecessary pain and suffering, constituting cruel and unusual punishment. In response, the state argued that both the electric chair and firing squad adhered to existing legal procedures, and there was no legal precedent requiring executions to be instantaneous or painless for those sentenced to death. On July 31, 2024, the South Carolina Supreme Court, in a 5-judge ruling, dismissed the lawsuit and upheld the constitutionality of both the electric chair and firing squad. The majority of the justices voiced support for these methods, with 3 backing the firing squad and 4 favoring the electric chair. This ruling paved the way for the potential resumption of executions in South Carolina, affecting all 32 inmates on the state's death row, including Sigmon. At the time of this ruling, 5 condemned inmates, consisting of Sigmon, Freddie Eugene Owens, Michael Mahdi, Richard Bernard Moore, and Marion Bowman Jr., had exhausted all avenues of appeal and were listed for imminent execution on later dates. The 13-year moratorium on executions in South Carolina came to an end on September 20, 2024, when one of the 5 inmates, Freddie Owens, was executed for the 1997 murder of a convenience store clerk. Richard Moore later became the second condemned inmate to die on November 1, 2024. Marion Bowman Jr. became the third of the 6 condemned inmates on the list to die on January 31, 2025. On February 7, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued Sigmon's death warrant and scheduled his execution for March 7, 2025. The court gave him until February 21st to select his preferred method of execution, with the options of lethal injection, electrocution, or firing squad. If he declined to choose a method, the electric chair would be chosen by default. A week after the death warrant was signed, Sigmon filed an appeal for a stay of execution, asking the court to delay his death warrant until his lawyers received the autopsy report of Marion Bowman Jr., whose execution took place 2 weeks prior, in order to review the report before selecting the preferred method of Sigmon's execution. According to Sigmon's lawyers, Sigmon did not want to die on the electric chair and wanted to choose between firing squad and lethal injection, but he was hesitant to pick the latter option due to witnesses' accounts that in the state's previous 3 executions, the inmates were not pronounced dead within 20 minutes after receiving a single dose of pentobarbital. On February 21, 2025, Sigmon appealed to the South Carolina Supreme Court to hear more evidence of his brain damage, mental illness, and childhood trauma. All factors Sigmon cited as making him ineligible for capital punishment. That same day, Sigmon chose to be executed by firing squad. Only 3 people, all in Utah, were put to death by firing squad since the 1976 resumption of capital punishment in the United States, the most recent being in 2010. At the age of 67, Sigmon would also be the oldest person executed in South Carolina since the resumption of capital punishment in 1976. According to his lawyer, Sigmon felt that the electric chair might burn and cook him alive. He feared that lethal injection would cause him to suffer a prolonged death that lasted more than 20 minutes, and he knew that the firing squad would give him a violent death. Although Sigmon did not wish to inflict that pain on his family, executioners, and witnesses, he nonetheless decided that the firing squad as the best option in light of the alleged risks of lethal injection, highlighted by the previous 3 executions conducted before his. In response to inquiries, the South Carolina Department of Corrections stated that they were ready to carry out firing squad executions, as they completed the renovation of the death chamber catered for firing squad. When such executions are carried out, the inmate will be hooded and strapped into the chair. A 3-member firing squad team, armed with rifles containing live ammunition, will be set to open fire once the warden reads the execution order. The team will stand 15 feet away from the prisoner before shooting. The witnesses to the execution, including reporters, family members of the victims, and inmate attorneys and prison staff, would only see the right side profile of the inmate, behind the bullet-resistant glass. Another report revealed that the prison department had spent about $54,000 to construct the firing squad death chamber in 2022. On February 27, 2025, after the release of Marion Bowman's autopsy report, Sigmon appealed to the South Carolina Supreme Court to further delay his execution. Sigmon stated that he was entitled to further information regarding the lethal injection drug and administration procedure. His lawyers claimed that Sigmon was forced to choose a violent death due to him fearing a more tortuous death by lethal injection with double doses of pentobarbital, citing that Marion Bowman was executed with 2 doses of pentobarbital and had fluid in his lungs, which led to the sensation of drowning. However, on March 4, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court unanimously denied Sigmon's request to a stay of execution. As a final resort, Sigmon appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States to put a stop to his execution. It denied the appeal on the afternoon of March 7, 2025, hours before the scheduled execution. Apart from his final court appeals, Sigmon also petitioned for clemency from the governor Henry McMaster, and his supporters stated that Sigmon was a reformed man who was often friendly with other inmates and devoted himself to religion, and that he was no longer the same man who brutally killed 2 people. Thus, he deserved mercy based on his rehabilitative progress. However, McMaster denied clemency for Sigmon. In response to the upcoming execution of her former boyfriend, Rebecca Barbare, now known as Rebecca Armstrong, stated that she did not believe in the death penalty, but nonetheless wanted Sigmon to face the consequences for murdering her parents. Armstrong said her parents were simple country folks with 5 children who often looked out for people around them, and her father had a good heart, and that they were the ones keeping the family together. Armstrong's son, the grandson of the Larkes, planned to attend the execution, as he wanted Sigmon to pay the ultimate price for the murder of his grandparents. On March 7, 2025, Sigmon was put to death by firing squad in the Broad River Correctional Institution. The firing squad fired at 6:05 p.m., and Sigmon flexed his arms and heaved in the chair for a few seconds before he fell motionless, and he was pronounced dead at 6:08 p.m. Sigmon became the 4th person in the United States to be executed by firing squad since 1976, and the first since the execution of Ronnie Lee Gardner in Utah in June 2010. As a result of Sigmon's execution, South Carolina became the 2nd state in the United States to carry out a firing squad execution. The country's first 3 firing squad executions since 1976, including Gardner's, were conducted by Utah. For his last meal, Sigmon requested fried chicken from KFC, green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. Sigmon originally asked for 3 buckets of the fried chicken and wanted to share them with the other inmates, but his request was denied by the prison department. In his final statement, Sigmon hoped for the end of the death penalty and found it unjustified under the New Testament for him to pay with his life for the murders of David and Gladys Larke, stating that they were no longer living under the Old Testament and no one had the authority to take lives except for God. Reportedly, Sigmon's lawyers, the family members of the Larkes, the prosecution, religious counselors, and 3 reporters were present to witness the execution.
In the curtain open, Brad Sigmon was strapped into the chair. Unlike other death executions I've seen, he was in a black jumpsuit, had black Crocs-like shoes on. He was completely strapped in. It looked like there was a harness over him. There was a strap over his head. His ankles were shackled. He had a covering over his mouth that, was from about here down. When the curtain opened, he looked towards his attorney, who was on the front row of the witness. They kind of exchanged. They had an exchange. I couldn't tell because his mouth was covered what they were mouthing back and forth to each other, but it looked like he was just saying he was okay to his attorney, Sigmon did. At that point, they had the attorney came out and read the final statement. When the final statement was read, well, let me back up one step. he had a target over his heart when the curtain opened. It was already there. It was a little rectangle white paper, or I'm assuming it was paper, could have been cloth. They had a bullseye on it. It had one outer ring and one inner ring on it. It was red. The bullseye was red. So they came out, read his final statement. At that point, when that was finished, a prison employee got a hood, put the hood over Sigmon's head. Then that prison employee walked from the chair, the 15 feet over to where there's a brick wall, and at that point there's a black shade, like one of those shades that you pull down and it rolls up. So that there's a black shade there. The prison employee lifted up the shade, and then from that point it was a little less than 2 minutes of nothing at that moment. I mean, you could see Brad Sigmon took several pretty deep breaths, and then suddenly the shots rang out at, I believe Christy said it was 6:05 and 50 seconds. At that point, you did see a small red stain on Sigmon's chest. It was irregularly shaped, but oval, if that makes sense. I mean, like it wasn't like a circle; it was an oval shape. I saw it looked like he may have taken a couple of his chest rose and fell about 2 times immediately after the shots. You could see a tiny piece of like tissue or something that was coming out of that. At that point, also his arm tensed up when he got shot. There's kind of this brief moment of tensing. After that, the doctor was in there fairly quickly, less than a minute after the shots came. Couldn't see exactly what the doctor did because my viewpoint was blocked from his back. But he did an examination for about 90 seconds, and then he walked back towards the other side of the room, walked from left to right as I'm viewing, and then that's when the prison employee announced 6:08 as the time of death.
At 6:01, the curtain was pulled back, exposing the room to us. Brad Sigmon was already strapped into. He had the chair did not have arms, so his arms were down to his side and clipped in with restraints. His feet were restrained. He had a strap across his forehead, and he also had something that appeared a little like a sling that covered his mouth. But he could move his head just a little bit, so he moved his head to the extent that he could toward the witness room, appeared to be exchanging some words with Bo King, his attorney. Kind of took in the whole witness room to the extent that he could. I want to comment on the expression that he had. Again, you couldn't see his whole face, but I did not pick up on anything in his expression that would have indicated fear. At 6:03, they put the hood on, and at 6:04, they lifted the shade on the what I would describe as cubbies that the executioners were going to shoot through. We could not see the guns. There was also no countdown or anything like that to tell us when the shots would be fired. The shots were fired at 6:05. I perceived that they were all fired at once, that it was just one sound. His arms flexed. There was something in his midsection that moved. I'm not necessarily going to call them breaths. I don't really know, but there was some movement that went on there for 2 or 3 seconds. It was very fast. I did see a splash of blood when the bullets entered his body. It was not a huge amount, but there was a splash that you could see kind of protrude from the wound, and the target was you couldn't really see what happened to the target. It just wasn't there anymore.
This is much one of the differences I tell people is this is much quicker. Lethal injections in South Carolina from start to finish take about 20 minutes these days. When I look back, the electrocution took they give one big jolt of electricity for several seconds, but then there's another jolt for a minute or two. So there's a longer period of what happens. This, I mean, it was instantaneous, and the time from the shots being fired to the time death was declared was a little over 2 minutes, I think, if I remember correctly.
Thank you.